David Foster was your typical suburban husband on the surface. He was 42, fit, well-liked by the neighbors, and a dedicated financial advisor with a thriving practice in Boston. But it wasn't his professional life that had the town of Riverton buzzing with whispered rumors. No, it was something much more personal, an affair with his wife's best friend that ended in bloodshed. It all started innocently enough. His wife, Lisa, had a best friend since college, a striking woman named Emily Williams. At 38, Emily was vibrant, outgoing, and everything that Lisa wasn't. Lisa, a reserved and gentle woman, was content to stay home, care for their 3 children, and live the quiet life in the affluent Riverton suburb. But David craved excitement, and Emily provided just that. Emily had always been part of their lives. She was there for birthdays, holidays, and summer barbecues. Lisa trusted her completely, never once suspecting that Emily would betray her in the most unforgivable way. David and Emily had known each other for years, but something changed during the winter of 2021. With Lisa's frequent weekend trips to visit her aging parents, David found himself alone more often than he liked, and Emily, well, she seemed to always be available. It began with casual chats. Emily would swing by after Lisa left town, at first just to check in. "You must be bored with Lisa away," she'd say, offering to keep him company. But soon, their conversations became more personal, more intimate. They shared secrets, gripes about their respective marriages, and slowly, lines began to blur. That first kiss was a mistake. At least, that's what David told himself. It happened in the quiet of his kitchen, after they had been sitting too close on the couch. One moment they were laughing about some silly memory from years ago, and the next, his lips were on hers. The spark was instant, igniting a passion neither had felt in years. They pulled away quickly, but it was already too late. The door had been opened. The affair that followed was torrid, reckless. They met in secret, hotel rooms, the back of David's car, anywhere they could steal a few moments alone. It wasn't just the physical attraction. It was the thrill of the secrecy, the danger. They were careful at first, but as the months passed, their recklessness grew. Lisa never suspected a thing. She was too trusting, too focused on her family and her duties. Emily was her best friend, her confidant, and David, he was the picture-perfect husband, always attentive, always caring. But behind that facade, the affair deepened. It was late one night in August when things took a turn. Emily had been pushing David to leave Lisa, to end the marriage so they could be together openly. But David was hesitant. He loved the life he had built with Lisa, loved his children, and the thought of destroying it all for a fling was terrifying. Emily, however, was growing impatient. She didn't want to be the other woman any longer. "I'm tired of sneaking around, David," she whispered harshly in his ear after one of their meetings. "You need to make a choice. It's me or her." David brushed her off, assuring her that he needed more time. But Emily wasn't having it. She began showing up at his house unannounced, calling him at odd hours, and even leaving gifts in places Lisa could find them. It was as if she wanted to be caught, as if she was daring David to confess. The tension reached a boiling point on a warm Saturday night in September. Lisa was out of town again, and David had invited Emily over, hoping to calm her down, to reason with her. But things quickly spiraled out of control. Emily arrived drunk, her eyes wild with jealousy and rage. She accused David of using her, of playing her for a fool. "You're never going to leave her, are you?" Emily shouted, pacing the living room, knocking over a vase in her fury. David tried to calm her down, but she wasn't listening. "You're a coward, David. A pathetic coward." The argument escalated. David's calm demeanor shattered, and before he knew it, they were both screaming. Emily grabbed a kitchen knife, threatening to tell Lisa everything, to destroy his life if he didn't choose her. In a moment of pure panic, David lunged at her, trying to wrestle the knife from her hand. But in the struggle, something went horribly wrong. Emily fell to the floor, the knife buried deep in her chest. David stood there for what felt like an eternity, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared down at Emily's lifeless body. He couldn't believe what had just happened. One moment they were fighting, and the next, she was gone. He knelt beside her, trying to stop the bleeding, But it was no use. Emily was dead, and he was the one who had killed her. Panic set in. David knew there was no way to explain this, no way to make it right. David Foster was frozen, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts all at once. He could hear his own breath, ragged and shallow, as if someone had punched the air out of his lungs. The reality of Emily's body, lying lifeless in front of him, slowly sank in. Her blood pooled on the living room floor, and the quiet suburban home that had always felt so safe and comfortable now seemed like a crime scene from a nightmare. He had to think fast. Lisa would be back tomorrow morning, and if she found out what had happened, if anyone found out, it would be the end of everything. He'd lose his family, his career, his freedom. The life he had worked so hard to build would crumble to nothing. David stood up, his hands trembling as he wiped Emily's blood from his fingers, smearing it on his shirt. He couldn't call the police, not without losing everything. But leaving her there wasn't an option either. He needed a plan. Something fast. Something desperate. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the car keys lying on the kitchen counter. He could take her somewhere. Someplace far enough away that no one would connect it back to him. The more he thought about it, the clearer the plan became. He'd load her body into the trunk, drive out to the woods, and make it look like a random attack. Maybe a mugging gone wrong. Anything that would throw the police off his trail. The adrenaline coursing through his veins propelled him into action. David grabbed an old tarp from the garage, wrapping Emily's body as tightly as he could. He struggled to lift her. She felt heavier than he imagined, her limp form resisting him like dead weight. After what felt like an eternity, he managed to get her into the trunk of his car, his heart pounding harder with each passing second. The suburban streets were eerily quiet as he drove through the night, taking the back roads to avoid being seen. Every passing car made his palms sweat, his mind conjuring images of police lights flashing in his rearview mirror. But no one stopped him. No one suspected a thing. Riverton was asleep, blissfully unaware of the crime unfolding in its midst. David drove for miles, deep into the woods where the trees grew thick and the roads were dark and deserted. He pulled over near a trailhead, far from any houses or cameras. The moonlight cast long shadows as he dragged Emily's body from the trunk, his muscles burning with effort. He stumbled through the underbrush, desperate to find a spot secluded enough to dump her body without being discovered too soon. Finally, after what felt like hours, he found a small clearing by a shallow creek. It was isolated, quiet, the perfect place to leave no trace. David laid her down gently, as though the care he showed in death could somehow atone for what he had done. He covered her with branches, rocks, anything he could find to make it look like a random crime scene. He stood there for a moment, staring down at Emily's lifeless body one last time, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Then, without another glance, he turned and made his way back to the car. As he drove home, the reality of what had happened began to claw at him. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the sound of his shallow breathing. He had killed Emily, his wife's best friend, the woman he had been having an affair with for months. His mind raced with the consequences. What if the police found her too soon? What if someone saw him? What if they traced it all back to him? He'd be ruined. Everything he had worked for, his family, his career, would be over in an instant. By the time David pulled back into his driveway, the first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon. Exhausted and terrified, he stumbled into the house, his blood-soaked clothes still clinging to him like a second skin. He stripped them off, tossing them into a garbage bag he intended to burn later. He scrubbed his hands, his arms, his face, trying to wash away the evidence, the guilt. But no matter how hard he scrubbed, he couldn't erase what had happened. When Lisa returned the next morning, everything seemed normal. She walked through the door, greeted David with a tired smile, and asked how his weekend had been. He forced a smile, kissed her on the cheek, and pretended like nothing had changed. But inside, David was unraveling. Days passed, and Emily's disappearance became the talk of the town. Lisa was frantic, calling Emily's phone nonstop, going from door to door asking if anyone had seen her. The police were involved now, canvassing the neighborhood, asking questions. David stayed calm, rehearsing his alibi over and over in his mind. He had been home, he said, alone, watching TV. No one could place him anywhere near Emily's last known location. But then, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A week after Emily's disappearance, a local hiker stumbled across her body in the woods. The news spread like wildfire. Riverton was in shock. First a missing person, now a murder. The police ramped up their efforts, determined to find who had done this. David's anxiety grew with every passing day. The police questioned him, of course. He had been one of the last people to see Emily alive, after all. But he kept his story straight, never wavering. No one suspected a thing. Not yet. But secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply they're buried. And as the police investigation dug deeper into Emily's life, her affair with David was bound to come up sooner or later. David's biggest fear was that someone would remember. Someone would have seen them together, someone would know. And when that happened, everything would come crashing down. As the investigation continued, Lisa grew more and more distant, her grief over Emily's death consuming her. She cried herself to sleep most nights, and David found it harder and harder to keep up the facade. He was haunted by nightmares, images of Emily, her lifeless eyes staring up at him from the forest floor, blood pooling around her. The pressure was building. It was only a matter of time before someone figured out the truth. David had gotten away with murder for now, but how long could he keep up the charade? As the investigation deepened, Riverton felt the weight of Emily's death hanging over the town like a dark cloud. The neighbors whispered behind closed doors, speculating about what could have happened to the vibrant woman they all knew. Some wondered if it was a random act of violence, while others couldn't shake the feeling that it had to be someone close to her. David, meanwhile, was unraveling. His days at the office became unbearable. Every phone call, every email, seemed like it could be the police finally connecting the dots. He constantly looked over his shoulder, terrified that someone would point the finger at him, or worse, Lisa would find out the truth. Lisa had become a shell of herself. She and Emily had been inseparable for years, and now, her best friend was gone, brutally murdered. Lisa spent hours with the police, poring over every detail of Emily's life, trying to find something, anything, that could explain why this had happened. But nothing seemed to make sense. What neither Lisa nor the police realized was that the answer was right in front of them the entire time. David played the grieving friend perfectly, offering Lisa support as she mourned and sticking close to the family. Every word he spoke to the investigators was carefully rehearsed, and still, no one suspected him. But as the weeks dragged on, cracks began to appear in David's carefully constructed facade. The guilt of what he had done weighed on him every waking moment. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's body lying in that clearing, lifeless and cold. Her voice echoed in his mind, accusing him, reminding him that he had taken her life. And then came the breaking point. One night, David awoke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been having another nightmare about Emily, but this time, it felt different. He saw her standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him, her eyes wide with anger and betrayal. He sat up, gasping for air, only to realize it was just a hallucination. Or was it? The constant stress of hiding the affair, of hiding the murder, was eating him alive. Every time he looked at Lisa, he felt like he was suffocating under the weight of his guilt. How could he face her, knowing what he had done? How could he continue to pretend like nothing had happened, when everything had changed? But the truth was, he couldn't. Not much longer, at least. David's paranoia started getting the best of him. He became obsessed with the idea that someone was watching him. Maybe it was the police, maybe it was a neighbor, or maybe it was Lisa herself. Every time his phone rang, he expected to hear the cold voice of a detective on the other end, telling him that they had figured it all out. It didn't help that the police had found more clues linking David to Emily. They uncovered text messages, just a few, but enough to suggest something more than friendship between them. They had asked him about it, and David had deflected, claiming the messages were harmless. But he could tell the investigators weren't entirely convinced. That was when David knew he needed to take control of the situation, or risk losing everything. One night, As Lisa lay asleep in their bed, David found himself pacing the house, his mind racing. The pressure was too much, the lies too big to keep hidden anymore. He couldn't take it. Something had to give. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, but this was different. This was life or death. His life or death. There was only one option left. He had to cover his tracks better. He needed to make sure that no one, not the police, not the neighbors, not even Lisa, would ever be able to piece together what had really happened. The next morning, David began laying the groundwork. He deleted every remaining trace of his and Emily's affair. Emails, texts, any record of them being together. He cleaned his car meticulously, scrubbing every inch of it, just in case there was some speck of evidence he had missed. He disposed of the clothes he had worn the night of the murder, burning them in the fireplace while Lisa was out shopping. He thought he had covered all his tracks. He thought he had taken care of every loose end. But he hadn't counted on one thing. The final, cruel twist of fate that would undo him completely. It happened one afternoon, when Lisa was sorting through some old things in the attic. She had been going through photo albums, trying to distract herself from the grief of losing Emily, when she stumbled across something she hadn't seen before. A small envelope, tucked inside one of David's old briefcases. Curious, Lisa opened it. Inside were a few pieces of paper. Love notes, handwritten, from Emily to David. They were short, sweet, but unmistakable in their meaning. I can't stop thinking about you. When are we meeting again? I miss your touch. Lisa's hands began to shake as she read the words. Her mind couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. Was this real? Could it really be true that her husband, her David, had been having an affair with her best friend? In a daze, Lisa stuffed the notes back into the envelope and sat down on the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like she was going to be sick. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. David came home later that evening, tired from a long day at the office. He had no idea what was waiting for him when he walked through the door. Lisa was sitting at the kitchen table, the envelope of notes in front of her. He stopped in his tracks when he saw the look on her face. Lisa, what's going on? He asked, trying to sound casual, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his fear. Lisa didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and rage. Then, slowly, she pushed the envelope across the table toward him. David's blood ran cold when he saw it. He knew exactly what it was, and he knew that this was the moment everything would come crashing down. You were having an affair, Lisa whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. With Emily, my best friend. David opened his mouth to deny it, but no words came out. What was the point? Lisa had already found the proof. There was no way out of this. I'm so sorry, Lisa, he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But Lisa wasn't listening. She was already dialing the police, her hands trembling as she punched in the numbers. David's heart sank as he realized it was all over. There was no escaping the truth now. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now, he would have to face the consequences. David's heart raced as he watched Lisa dial the police. His mind was spinning, searching for something, anything, that could stop her. But what could he say? The truth was out now, and there was no undoing it. He lunged forward, grabbing the phone from her hand. Lisa, wait. Please. Just let me explain, he pleaded, his voice desperate. But the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. There was no going back. She was done. Done with the lies. Done with the betrayal. She stood up from the table, her body trembling with rage and heartbreak. Explain, she spat. You lied to me for months. You slept with my best friend. And now she's dead. What is there to explain, David? Her words hit him like a hammer, each one heavier than the last. David could feel the walls closing in around him. He had to come up with something fast, something that would stop her from making the call that would end everything. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he stammered. I didn't. It was an accident, Lisa. I swear. An accident? Lisa's voice was barely a whisper now, trembling with disbelief. How is any of this an accident, David? How is having an affair with Emily an accident? David hesitated for a moment, then the truth came pouring out faster than he could stop it. I didn't want it to go this far. I never meant to hurt her. That night, she came over, and we argued. She was upset. She was threatening to tell you everything, and I panicked. I tried to stop her, but what? Lisa's voice was growing sharper, her disbelief turning into horror as she realized what he was saying. What did you do, David? David swallowed hard. His mouth felt dry, his throat tight. There was no more hiding. He had to come clean now, or lose everything. It was an accident, Lisa. I swear. We were fighting, and she grabbed a knife. I tried to stop her, but we struggled, and she fell. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to kill her. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, suffocating the silence between them. Lisa stood frozen, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. She stared at him, her face pale with shock. You killed her, she whispered. You killed Emily? David nodded, his head hanging low in shame. I didn't mean to, he said softly. It was an accident, but I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I thought if I could just make her disappear, no one would know. No one would find out. Lisa backed away from him, her hands shaking as she covered her mouth in horror. The man she had trusted, the man she had built a life with, had just confessed to murder. Her best friend was dead, and her husband was responsible. I can't believe this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't believe you. How could you do this, David? He tried to take a step toward her, but she flinched, holding up her hand to stop him. Don't come near me, she warned, her voice trembling with fear and anger. You killed her, David. You killed Emily. How could you? David felt the ground slipping out from under him. He had lost her. He had lost everything. I'm sorry, he whispered, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. Lisa turned and ran for the door, grabbing her purse and keys. I'm calling the police, she said, her voice steadier now, more resolute. You need to turn yourself in. I can't help you, David. Not after this. He didn't stop her this time. He knew there was no point. As he watched Lisa walk out the door, the full weight of his actions came crashing down on him. There was no escaping what he had done. Emily was dead, and he was the reason why. David stood there in the empty house, listening to the silence that followed. He knew the police would come soon. He knew they would take him away, and that his life, as he knew it, was over. There would be no more secrets, no more lies. The truth had come out, and now he would have to pay the price. The hours seemed to stretch on as he sat in the living room, waiting for the inevitable. The sunlight that had streamed through the windows earlier was fading, casting long shadows across the room. David's mind raced, replaying everything that had happened in the last few months. The affair, the lies, the fight with Emily, her lifeless body in the woods. He felt sick to his stomach, overwhelmed by the realization of what he had done. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens snapped him back to reality. The police were here. His time was up. He stood as the flashing red and blue lights filled the street outside. The door burst open, and officers flooded into the house, guns drawn. David raised his hands, offering no resistance as they placed him in handcuffs and read him his rights. As they led him out of the house, David caught a glimpse of Lisa standing on the front lawn, her face pale and tear-streaked. She didn't look at him as he was loaded into the back of the police car, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from her. He wanted to tell her he was sorry, wanted to explain that he never meant for things to end this way. But what good would it do? The damage was done, and there was no taking it back. As the car pulled away from the house, David closed his eyes, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds. Emily was dead. Lisa was gone. And soon, he would be, too. The secrets he had tried so hard to keep had destroyed everything.